up for review today is a new knife that I'm testing. This is a knife by Morandi, or Lucas Morandi, I guess I should say. He is a Brazilian knife maker from the Sao Paulo area. Relatively unknown, I would say. I haven't heard his name floating much around the forums, which I think is an exciting opportunity to show off what he can do. I was pretty excited when this one came up. It's the first time that Lucas has done a convex grind, which I think that if you look at the polish here, it's clear that it really benefits from that convex geometry from the full stone finish. Looking here near the tip, we see a bit of a wavy shoulder right here. That imperfect shinogi is actually a bit of a good sign in my experience because it tells us that the maker has accurately reflected their geometry with the visual signals we get from the knife, with the shinogi line specifically. So when you see a perfectly straight, crisp shinogi, there is a very strong chance that it's actually a false indicator. That's because craftspeople can simply tape over the area that they want that shinogi to go, and then they use abrasive like sandpaper or some kind of media blast to make the geometry look perfect and crisp. However, that can hide ugly low spots, other weird transitions that you wouldn't want showing up in your overall geometry. And here that's just not the case. The shinogi is not perfectly straight, but it's actually still pretty consistent throughout the main bevel. Again, for somebody who isn't super well known, I think that this is an impressive knife. You look at the dimensionality, it starts off quite thick coming out of the handle, and then just a beautiful taper going down towards the end. That thin tip is going to be advantageous for doing fine work there. Let's try to get a choil appearance. I don't think this is going to show up really well on camera, but you can zoom in if you're interested in seeing. This is a bit of a midweight grind. It's pretty thick. Closer you get to the spine, gets to the midweight point about midway through, and then right behind the edge, it is in fact incredibly thin. One thing that's worth pointing out is that this choil shot in particular is not indicative of the geometry of the entire knife. So as you probably saw at the spine, it gets very thin just behind the tip. And so the question is this reflective as the behind the edge geometry shows from the choil shot? The answer is generally going to be yes, but let's actually see it. Let's actually check this out. I am making Japanese curry today. That's nice because it highlights several different ingredients we're going to do. The first one is a bit of fatty pork. Fatty pork is a fun place to start because it shows the way that the knife is finished off as far as the edge goes. Often you'll have makers that send the knife out and the edge coming from them, even coming from a factory knife, can just not be ground coarsely enough at the edge. So it's got an edge that's over polished or that it's been rounded over, which makes it very difficult to grip that fatty surface. So pork is a nice thing because it shows have they actually put enough toothiness onto the edge here. And then as we go through other ingredients, we of course do want to see at least enough refinement in order to get through other products. And so it's that balance question of, is this maker experienced enough in putting fine edges on kitchen knives that split the difference between an overly coarse edge and an overly polished edge. So if it can accomplish both, we're good. And as you should see here, this is having absolutely no problem getting through the pork. You see, we just plowed through that pork. A little bit of grippiness at the fat at the end, but just pulls right apart with your fingers. So I'm liking the result we're seeing from the meat that we're getting through. That's not a particularly strong challenge, so let's move on to the next thing. We'll be testing 4 different products during this review today. The first one is the potato here. Potato is just a classic test. We'll be cutting it up into some cubes and seeing how the knife does. The apple is going to be our wedge test king. This is one of the densest products that is pretty common to find in a kitchen. So we're going to be bisecting this and listening for the sound it makes. This will tell us how the geometry performs, in particular if the stiction of the smooth polish is causing it to crack in half or stick. So what we're listening for is, does it split? Do we hear a sharp crack, or do we hear smooth cuts and followed by taps? Carrot, we're just going to be cutting some coins off of this carrot, and so I don't think it'll be anything too difficult. As far as wedging goes, we'll be looking at release of those coins off the bevel, and then maybe for a bisection, some splitting minorly. Back to the potato, I wanted to mention that this is a very good test to see how the knife does with the thinness of the blade versus the convexity of it. As I'm cutting it up into cubes, I want to see how the potato holds up. Is the product getting pushed all over, the convexity and the food release causing it to fall apart as I cut through it, or is it clamping onto the side of the knife and sticking and making it very hard to keep everything in one piece? If it stays solid as I cut through it and it all sticks together, that is an excellent sign. Last up, of course, is the onion dice. Onion dice is just a classic test. We want to see how much resistance is there on the verticals as we cut up and down. Do we come through smoothly or not? Horizontals, how much force do we have that we need to apply before it cuts through in order to get the horizontals? If it's too much, then that suggests we might have a bit of a weird shoulder or some stiction occurring on the bevels that's preventing us from getting a clean cut through those horizontals. All right, without further ado, let's get started. I'll speed up through this bit so you don't have to watch me prepping the onion. We're just getting the outer skins off, and then once we have the two halves ready, we'll go ahead and put it to the cutting test. First up is the verticals. Go kind of slow at the beginning just to see what we're looking at, and then go a bit quicker through the middle. So overall seeing some pretty good movement, but here at the end, the knife is pulling quite a bit as we get through these verticals. It's not clear if that's just because of the light surface on the polish, meaning that we have water tension from the onion causing sticking here. The convexity should help out with that, but for whatever reason, we're not seeing that. And then we are seeing the advantage of the convexity here as the onion dice just kind of falls off on the other end. Get this one wrapped up, and we'll go ahead and try a second half, see what we see on round 2 of onion dice. Again, we're seeing some pretty smooth motion up and down, just right there. It's sticking the knife, and it's sticking so hard that it's actually tugging the whole product along as we move the knife. Typically, you'd expect to see that get, oh, yeah, that's rough. You have part of the product getting pulled off just from the force of the onion sucking onto the knife, and then when you move the knife, that force is being applied to the product. So this being a bit of a heavier grind, not super disappointing that the horizontal cuts aren't able to make it through as cleanly as you would on a super fine laser. But having used both the heel and the tip on these horizontals, I think it's fair to say that that is not the use case that we're going to end up seeing this knife excel at. Alright, skipping ahead, we're going on to the potato test. Quick reminder here, what we're looking for is to square up the potato first. I'm going to save these skins for a potato cauliflower soup I do a little bit later, but we're just interested in this potato dice. We're going to go straight up and down, and we're looking to see how much is the product getting knocked around as we do this. So as I cut through, you can see it's moving around a little bit. I think that's just my bad technique. I'm not able to see it from the position I'm standing at. The camera's looking right over, and you can see that I'm moving it with my left hand. But the knife itself is actually doing a pretty good job. It's keeping it right in place. It's moving through smoothly, but the convexity is also not, the convexity of the shoulder is not just shoving it all over the place. You're not seeing the stacks get knocked over. Try it on the next one. Square it up. Another thing is that because potatoes have a lot of starch in them, the water tension effect can become even a little bit more exaggerated on stiction. As you are moving the knife up and down the product, it will suck on and can potentially cause wedging issues that don't occur in other products. Here, though, we're not seeing an issue. And in fact, this dice is quite smooth. You see that that whole thing stayed together, and I was really not holding it together very much, except just with the tension of my hand on top. Going for a third one. Again, you notice that there is some movement from the knife going through, but not enough to make this worrisome. Most of the slipping, most of the sloppiness here is coming from my left hand. And again, I don't have perfect knife technique, and so that's practically to be expected. And I think we'll forgive the knife for the sins of the user that's holding it here. All right, let's do one more, just so that we get the same results. This one is a little bit of a wider potato. We can put some more cuts into it. and then we've stacked it high just to see how much it moves. And here we are seeing it move just a little bit, but still holding all together. Do that final cut through, and yeah, that has passed our potato test with flying colors. Next up, we've got an apple. See our wedge test, bisection through. Oh, that is beautiful. Basically no sound, silent as it goes down, just a gentle tap on the board once it gets through. Let's go ahead and clean this up. This isn't really showing anything past the original bisection, but well, I need to put this in the food, so we'll cut out the cores here. I'll speed up, go a little bit faster through this next bit. Maybe the one thing that's worth pointing out here is that we see the apples kind of sticking to the side of the knife here, which is just a reflection again of the sticking that we saw before. Let's listen for our next bisection. Oh, that is beautiful. Love to hear that. This time I'm cutting it a little differently, you noticed. I'm not doing it directly in half, but just cutting off the core as we go, and that allows me to just go a little bit faster on this one. So go ahead and fast forward through this section as well as we just get the food cubed up to be ready to put into the curry. Alright, carrot test. Now, we do have this thicker one here, so I'm actually going to take advantage and do a bisection test on this one. First, we cut off a couple of coins. I go obliquely on this, twisting it about 90 degrees each time so that we get some interesting shapes to put in the food. This just kind of looks nice when you get it on your plate. There's no particular knife reason for it. Just, I like the way it looks, so we're doing that. And we wind up with this thicker piece on the end. Let's go ahead and put these off to the side. I'll square this guy up a little bit more, so we're dealing just with the thick section. And now we've got, let's look, 7 centimeters tall. Oh, again, very smooth. We are hearing some minimal cracking here. We're seeing some wedging. That isn't an issue. Every single knife is going to wedge at some point. Doesn't matter how great the geometry is. Every knife wedges. The question is, at what point does that happen? And we just saw in a fairly tall, fairly thick bisection that it was performing quite well. So if you listen to that sound, it's not a sharp crack. It's not difficult to get through. You're not going to hurt yourself if you push too hard and damage the edge once you hit. So that is, I think that's a great sign. That one passed that bisection with flying colors. As we finish off, we are cutting some coins off the carrot and looking at whether or not they stick to the blade. This one did fine, but we're going to cut another one here. It's a little bit of a shorter carrot, and we're going to actually notice that these pieces do stick onto the blade surface. This is a good illustration of trade-offs in terms of food release. There are two kinds of food release that we often discuss when we're talking about knives and convexity. The first one is much more dangerous, and it relates to wedging. And that's when food release causes stiction. It's unable to move around the surface, and water tension will cause it to suck on and not really let go. That can lead to cracking and basically just dynamic and static friction that makes it harder for the knife to move through the product. The second one is just a question of whether or not your product rolls off the bevels at the end. That's less of an issue of food safety and just something that's a little annoying. You have to clear the knife more often as you're cutting with it.
Okay, so that's through the entire process. You see that the edge is actually held up quite well. We're blasting through product even there at the end. Some closing thoughts on this. It's that the carrot went fairly well. We did hear some splitting when we did the tall bisection. That is completely to be expected. The question is never whether or not a knife will wedge, but rather at what point it starts to wedge. And so seeing it go through a carrot that 6-7 centimeters high and hearing minimal splitting is quite admirable. The apple test did quite well. We did hear some splitting, and the apple was also quite sticky on the edge of the blade. I think that this has to do quite a bit with the polish. Stone polishes almost always have a trade-off in cutting ability because of how smooth they are. It leads to a bit of stickiness with the water, but the convexity of the grind is helping out quite a lot with that. So it's not really an effect that I would count against it. It just is noticeable. Potato was probably the most impressive as far as I'm concerned. We did see, again, stickage. We didn't hear any wedging, and the main issue with stickage was not in cutting, but just in release as we pulled the blade through the product. So that was quite good. Lastly, the onion. I think the onion was the most difficult test. We saw some difficulty on the horizontals as the knife would stick going down. You saw me going quite slow, and then the horizontal cuts were probably the most difficult. We weren't able to get more than just a couple centimeters in. This I would chalk up just to the geometry of the blade. We saw that at the tip it was going in a little easier as opposed to the heel. It was barely making it in at all. It's quite sharp. The issue isn't that it's not sharp enough, but rather that it just grips so much as it goes in. I suspect that this is just a lot of convexity on the blade, especially as we get toward this last centimeter or so between the blade road and the edge. That the amount of convexity there is doing really well for food release in general during cutting, and at the same time when we try to go horizontal through an onion for that slice, that we just have a shoulder getting in the way. So one thing that I might do in the future is put this to the stones, see how much of a shoulder there is as we start experimenting with the bevels. But I don't think I'm going to do that soon. I really like this knife. I like the way that it performs, and I'm not really planning to change it for a while as I get used to it and continue to use. Anyway, hope this review has been helpful. Cheers.